Welcome to CWJah Talk number 17, which is part of a series that we began last week with CWJah Talk number 16, involving pre-Christian evidence that Jesus is the biblical Messiah. Last week we talked about and showed a pre-Christian copy of the book of Micah, a well-known figure even referenced by other biblical writers like Jeremiah, who wrote about things in connection with the biblical Messiah that the New Testament writers described as fulfilled in Jesus. But the text of Micah foretold the things about the one who would come in Jah's name well before Jesus was born. Similarly, in the text we're going to discuss and read today, Isaiah chapter 53 comes from a scroll as part of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and really the only complete biblical text that is in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are just very minor missing parts, but essentially it's the entire book of Isaiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered in the 1940s, and is datable to between 100 and 350 to 400 BCE, which is 100 to 350 or 400 years before Jesus was born, and about 400 to 700 years after Isaiah lived and wrote in the 8th century. So we have biblical texts that well establish the history of these people and the things that they did and the things that they wrote and the events that occurred, as well as the things that were foretold, which is what we're most concerned about, and which is why we're focused primarily on Isaiah chapter 53. There are other texts in the book of Isaiah that also have a messianic association. But Isaiah 53 is one of those texts that describes things in relation to the Messiah that are very unique. And so we're going to read about those things. But so the Isaiah scroll that we're going to read is one of several texts in the Dead Sea Scroll for the book of Isaiah, but it's the best. It's the most complete. There are other more fragmentary parts of the book of Isaiah in other Dead Sea Scroll texts. But we're going to focus on the great Isaiah scroll, as well as the later copies of the book of Isaiah that before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the 1940s, we were using to translate our texts. And those biblical copies are known as the Aleppo Codex from the 10th century. And by 10th century CE, I mean the 900s. Okay? So basically 800 plus years after Jesus lived. And then we also have from the 11th century, or in the tens, after the 900s, the thousands basically, right? When we say 11th century, so the first century we're counting from 0 up to 99 or 100, and then we go into the second century from 100 to 199 to 200, into the third century, and so on. And just to give you a little explanation in case you're unfamiliar with these designations. So then the Leningrad Codex is not too much far removed from the date of the Aleppo Codex, but is an entirely different text of the Hebrew Scriptures. They're pretty much identical with the Dead Sea Scroll text of Isaiah that we have, datable to 1,000 or more years before the Aleppo or Leningrad Codexes that we have been using for 1,000 years or more, or up to 1,000 years, basically. But that shows you that the book of Isaiah that we have is reliable for 1,000 plus years before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and now 2,000 plus years textually since the Dead Sea Scroll discovery. And the texts that we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls predate Jesus, as I mentioned. So when we read actually, I should say, the text of Isaiah 53, as I mentioned when I started the show, or in the pre-show discussion, it sounds like a New Testament text because the things that it describes, if you're familiar with the New Testament at all and the histories of Jesus, they fit him perfectly in almost every way. And I'll explain what I mean by almost in just a moment. Actually, the text will explain itself, and you'll see what I mean. And then we will quote and discuss one of the applications of Isaiah 53 from a New Testament writer, John, to the events of Jesus and in his engagement with some of the religious leaders of his day. So the Isaiah scroll, of which we have a complete copy from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and which dates to 1,000 or more years before the Aleppo and Leningrad codexes, which are up nearly 1,000 years before our time, provide us with a chain of manuscript integrity that is very hard to deny. Almost impossible, really, especially when you compare it with any other texts that have a similar historical transmission over that much time. So we have a lot of confidence in these texts. There's reasons why we believe in the Bible and in the books of the Bible. It's not just because it's the Bible. I mean, I think all of us at some point when we're young, we have a familiarity with the Bible, or those who do, and we have a sense of awe and appreciation just because it's the Bible. But then when you actually start reading it and you get into the text and you start talking about the evidence, well, then that's when you really begin to decide how much you believe in what is written. And so I preface our discussion here with these texts because that's really the primary basis for our beliefs, are the best available evidence for these texts. Not the later texts, which are proven to be accurate by the earlier texts, but these earlier texts provide us the best available evidence which we can use to show that before the things we came to believe and have come to believe about Jesus, these things were known and believed by those who didn't even know Jesus, but who were looking for someone whom their community over several thousand years had come to believe due to the promises made by Jah to Abraham, and then the activities of Jah through people like Moses, and then thereafter with the judges and kings of Israel and Judah. So there is a long history of events associated with these texts, and even before people like Abraham. But Abraham himself, being from Mesopotamia, carried a lot of information from that region to the areas that Jah sent him, and that's why the stories in the Bible often involve Abraham, and ultimately Jah chose him because he was tested and shown to be faithful. So it was through people like Abraham and Moses who wrote the law and who spoke of a prophet in Deuteronomy 18, another text we'll consider as part of this series. It was people like that Jah spoke of a seed, of a prophet, of a king, of a savior, and of one who would suffer and die, and carry the sins of many before being cut off from the living, and then raised to life again. So this is essentially the Christian story. The Judeo-Christian story that starts in the Garden of Eden and ends with Jesus and continues through in the New Testament writings so that we can read today about the things that we and others have believed were fulfilled in the one that the people who lived before Jesus spoke about. All right, so let's see what some of the things were written about or spoken about concerning this one before Jesus was born. I'm going to read for you Isaiah chapter 53, and I'm going to be reading from my translation of the text. You're free to read from whichever translation of the Bible you'd like. And let me see if I can get this here so that we can maybe read my section together. I think we can. Okay, so I'll go ahead and I'll change the screen so that you can read with me my translation of Isaiah 53. Let's go ahead and do that. And as you read this text with me, I think you're going to see, if you're at all familiar with the New Testament, that these things were fulfilled in Jesus, or at least were believed to have been fulfilled in Jesus. And we're going to read just one section from those New Testament writings that talks about this fulfillment in Jesus. Okay, so Isaiah chapter 53, this is a translation of the Hebrew text, our earliest text of the book of Isaiah, preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in the Aleppo and Leningrad codices, reads this way, according to how I understood the text. Who has believed where it concerns our report? And on account of whom has the arm of Jaho been shown? Verse 2, and he will grow up like the young plant grows toward its topsoil, and like the root grows away from the dry ground. No unique form or glory belongs to him. Glory I emphasize because that'll come up later when we discuss John 12. No unique form or glory belongs to him. So Isaiah is seeing his glory, the glory or lack thereof, whichever it is, whatever glory this one had or would have, he's seeing it. No unique form or glory belongs to him, and we will see him, but not with an appearance, so that we will desire him. Verse 3, despised and left alone by men, a man of sorrows and made to know sickness. We'll talk about that, or that will be explained in just a moment by the text itself. Since there's no real record of Jesus being sick, how did he know sickness? Despised like when the people hide their faces, and we have not held him in high regard. Verse 4, truly our sicknesses he himself has removed, and our sorrows he has carried, and we ourselves considered him as one afflicted. Let me read that again. And we ourselves considered him as one afflicted by God and disciplined. And we read that in the New Testament when those who opposed Jesus referred to him as having a demon, which in those days and even today would be associated with sickness and infirmities, and as one whom God obviously rejected. They condemned him in blasphemy. So Isaiah is talking about how they viewed this one or would view this one. This is one of the best texts we have in the entire Bible in terms of its antiquity and completeness and longevity in terms of its manuscript integrity over a course of time, unlike any of the other texts where we have complete copies of the book over 2,000 plus years before today that we can compare with little to no difference. Keep that in mind as we read these texts. This is before Jesus was born. This was before John wrote, before Matthew wrote. This was 130 to 50 or more years before Jesus died and all of those people wrote. Okay, let's get back to the text. Verse 5, but he was pierced through because of our errors, badly beaten because of our guilt. Punishment for the sake of our security came to be upon him, and by his pain we have been healed. Remember what the Jews said in consultation together when they decided to kill Jesus? If we don't do something about him, the Romans will come and take away our nation. For the sake of our security. That's what they did. They pierced him through because of their errors and badly beat him, or allowed him to be by Pilate and his guards, for their security. This pierced through, we're often familiar with that in the book of Zechariah, another pre-Christian text we will read as part of this series, which is also datable to part of the Minor Prophet Scroll collection that Micah 5 was also part of. So it's not just Zechariah that foretold the Messiah would be pierced. It's Isaiah as well. Isaiah 53:5. Isaiah was written in the 8th century, And we have copies like in the Dead Sea Scroll, Isaiah 1Q, Isaiah A, the complete text that I'm referring to, the great Isaiah scroll, that were written 400 to 700 or so years after Isaiah wrote his original copy. So, and then Zechariah wrote in the 6th century. We'll discuss Zechariah as part of the series, either Zechariah or Deuteronomy 18 next. But in either case, it's both Zechariah 12 and Isaiah 53 that refer to the one who would come as one who would be pierced. And as we'll see when we read it or consider Zechariah 12:10, that text talks about how they would view him as a son, even how they would bewail him as a firstborn. That's also said in Isaiah or Zechariah 12:10. But we'll get to that next time or later as part of this series. So back to Isaiah 53, verse 6. We have all wandered away like a flock of sheep. Like a man to his own road, we have turned away. But Jaho has caused all of our guilt to meet up with him. Verse 7, he himself was treated severely and put down by others, yet he does not open his mouth. He is carried along like the one among a flock of sheep taken to be slaughtered, yet like a quiet sheep that is about to be sheared, he will not open his mouth. And we know that other than cry out to his father as he was dying, he went through that whole terrible process of being beaten and humiliated and having to be executed, just like a sheep. And that's why the New Testament often likens him in the same terms as Isaiah does here, and also to those who followed him as a flock of sheep. And he being one among a flock of sheep. Okay, back to the verses in Isaiah 53, verse 8. Because of coercion and because of judgment, he was taken away. And as for his generation, who will consider it? For he has been cut off from the land of the living because of the error of my people, those to whom the mark of death truly belongs. Verse 9. And his grave will be set up alongside criminals, and with the wealthy at his death, though he had done nothing wrong, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Verse 10. Jaho desired to break him down, to make him weak. If he will serve as compensation, then his soul will see the fruit of his sacrifice. That is why Jaho desired to break him down, or allow him to be broken down, just like he allowed Job to be broken down, because it proved that it was others who were doing these things, not him. And it showed by Jesus and by Job's sacrifice that they were the ones who were doing things properly according to Jah's will. And so when it says he desired to break them down, it is for the purpose of establishing them as fit to serve Jah. To serve in Jesus' case as compensation, because we had all been lost into a condition that required that compensation. And then the rest of verse 10 says his days will continue. After it says he was broken down and would serve as compensation, it says his soul will see the fruit of his sacrifice, resurrection in our view. His days will continue. And the desire of Jaho he will advance with his hand. It's similar to what Micah says and to what Jesus says all throughout the text that we have in the New Testament. Verse 11, due to the burden of his soul he will see. He will be satisfied with what he knows. And what does he know? What did he say he knows? What he learned from the Father. That's why it says, my servant, the righteous one, he will justify many when he himself carries their guilt. This is what they were reading about in terms of the Messiah who would come before Jesus came. Now, many of you may say, many Jews today apply this text to the nation of Israel, but there really is not there's not nearly as complete or clear of it as of an application as there is to an individual about whom this text clearly speaks. But even if you were going to say an individual in a figurative sense for the nation, the things that it speaks about with reference to what we read about being fulfilled in Jesus are either the greatest set of coincidences of things that were just made up and compiled during the time of Roman occupation when the Jews were persecuted and were not looking for someone like Jesus at all, or this really happened. And the texts that we're reading here that were written before the things we read about in connection with Jesus happening are uniquely descriptive of those things that we later read about, and some of which we'll read in just a second. But let's finish the text. But this fits everything from the death to the resurrection to him justifying many, carrying their guilt. And verse 12, and I will give him a share along with the great ones, and with the mighty ones he will divide up great wealth. For he has emptied his soul all the way to death. He has been counted among those who sinned, but he has carried away the sins of many. And he will stand up for those who sin. That's you and me. And when it says he emptied his soul all the way to death, doesn't that remind you of Jesus' words, Father, I entrust my spirit into your hands. And then it says his soul expired. So he gave his life all the way to the point where his life ended and was in the hands of his Father, whom for 3 days allowed the sacrifice to be given, and then gave him a share among the great ones, the mighty ones, which is why he's also called in Isaiah 6 a mighty God. But he is the Son of God, the firstborn. He is one of the sons of God who are gods in the sense that they do only what Jah does and tells them to do versus their own desire. And so there's no compromise whatsoever with monotheism. And that's why Isaiah both speaks about the Messiah as a mighty God and denies the existence of all other gods, that is, those gods of the nations, not the sons of God who only act as the one God. So this Messiah would do those things and carry away the sins of many. And so that's why we believe that Jesus is the Messiah, because of the things that were done in connection with him and the fact that he was given as a sheep to be slaughtered, according to the pre-Christian text, not just for no reason. These sacrifices had value, and the sacrifices up until Jesus died had value temporarily. But the sacrifice of the one who came in the name of Jaho because of our errors is the one who is able to save us permanently. So, nevertheless, when he did come, he was not always treated with respect. But before we read an account involving that, let me show you the text that we've been reading, or the earliest copy, the most complete copy of it. And that is this text. So 17 sheets of Isaiah. It's known as 1Q Isaiah B. And you can find this. This is on Wikipedia. And if you go to it, there's a digital copy up in the right-hand corner that will show you the sheets. Actually, we should be going from right to left here. And then you can just click on them. And then you can look at whichever part of the text you want for a better copy. Close-up look. So you can see a digital copy. You know, it gives you good detail. And then you just click it again. Click back out. You can go down to another part of the text. And you can compare this, if you're able to read Hebrew, with the later copies of the text, the Masoretic copies of the text that we have. And you can see for yourself how accurate it is. It's one of those add things I mentioned. So now, as I also would like to point out, often you'll hear about the text of Isaiah being written by 3 different authors. First Isaiah, Deutero Isaiah, Trito Isaiah. There's no evidence of that. You often will get literary arguments, but they're not compelling. And this text, the earliest complete text we have of Isaiah, shows no indication of any kind of break between the sections involving the alleged three authors of Isaiah. So there's no textual evidence supporting that theory. Now let's go to a text in John. Let me close out these little pop-ups here. And we'll read a section that involves the application of what we just read from the pre-Christian text of Isaiah. I'm going to read from the New World Translation because I haven't translated the entire 12th chapter of John, and I'm very familiar with the New World Translation as well as other translations, but I'm able to look at it, and if there's a problem or issue, deal with it, or if you have a question or comment, you can bring it up. But otherwise, I think it's a useful translation to use for sections like this until I complete it myself. So we're going to look at John chapter 12, and we're going to read verses 35 down through let's see. We'll read it down through verse 45. No, we'll read it through the end of verse 50. All right, 35 through 50. Let's read this together. Right here, we're going to start right here. Jesus therefore said to them, "The light will be among you a little while longer. Walk while you have the light, so that darkness does not overpower you. And he that walks in the darkness does not know where he is going." Verse 36, "While you have the light, exercise faith in the light, in order to become sons of light." Jesus spoke these things and went off and hid from them. Verse 37, "But although he had performed so many signs before them, they were not putting faith in him. So that the word of the prophet Isaiah the prophet was fulfilled." That what we just read, the text we read, could very well have been available to people like John in the first century, or a text like it. It was certainly written before John was born. "So that the word of Isaiah the prophet was fulfilled, which said, Jehovah, who has put faith in the thing heard by us? And as for the arm of Jehovah, to whom has it been revealed?" He's quoting Isaiah 53, what we just read. Verse 39, John now picks it up. He says, "The reason why they were not able to believe is that again Isaiah said," verse 40, "He has blinded their eyes and he has made their hearts hard. They should not see with their eyes and get the thought with their hearts and turn around and I should heal them." Verse 41, "Isaiah said these things because he saw his glory and he spoke about him." Now, Trinitarians will get, and I'm about to get off topic myself with this thing, but it comes up with this and say this is talking about Isaiah 6 and Isaiah seeing the glory of Jehovah. But he's clearly talking about Isaiah 53 and the arm of Jehovah, and the texts that speak about the glory of the Messiah, which, as we read about in Isaiah 53, right here, it talks about how no unique form or glory belongs to him. Now, this is made more apparent in the Septuagint, and I've written an entire article on this subject that you can read for yourself and that we can discuss further after the show. It's at the Elihu site, on Elihu Online Papers, right here. The glory seen by Isaiah according to John 12. I wrote this back in 2011, but it's still just as relevant. It goes through all the texts, goes through the texts in Isaiah that pertain to the subject, Isaiah 52 and 53. And so I think you'll find that interesting and hopefully satisfying in answer to any questions pertaining to the glory involving the Messiah as referred to here in John 12:41. And I'd be happy to talk further if you do. So let's pick up the text with that in mind at verse 42. "All the same, many even of the rulers actually put faith in him," that is Jesus, "but because of the Pharisees, they would not confess him in order not to be expelled from the synagogue." Verse 43, "For they love the glory of men more than even the glory of God. Verse 44, however, Jesus cried out and said, he that puts faith in me, not in me, puts faith not in me only, but in him also that sent me. Let me read that again. It's the NWT, and there's a few bracketed comments. He that puts faith in me puts faith not in me only, but in him also that sent me. Verse 45, and he that beholds me beholds also him that sent me, the Father. Verse 46, I have come as a light into the world, in order that everyone putting faith in me may not remain in darkness. Verse 47, just a couple more to go. But if anyone hears my sayings and does not keep them, I do not judge him. For I came not to judge the world, but to save the world. Jesus is later appointed judge, but he's referring to his purpose at this time. Verse 48, he that disregards me and does not receive my sayings has one to judge him. The word that I have spoken is what will judge him in the last day. Last two verses, verse 49 and 50. Because I have not spoken out of my own impulse, but the Father himself who sent me has given me a commandment as to what to tell and what to speak. Verse 50. Also, I know that his commandment means everlasting life. Therefore, the things I speak, just as the Father has told me them, so I speak them. That is the fulfillment of Isaiah 53. That is the arm of Jaho. That is the young plant that's growing toward its topsoil, like the root grows away from the dry ground. That is why we believe Jesus is the one who fulfilled these texts. We believe that the evidence we have in the book of Isaiah that's datable in a complete copy to 100 to 350 years before Jesus was born, that speaks about these things in such detail that we then read about in connection with Jesus. This is not something you could easily fabricate or make up and have as your background these earlier texts that foretell events while you're an occupied nation, surrounded by hostile forces, constantly at war, and someone comes who's not there to deliver you from those conditions, and yet all these things are said to have taken place? If you read Isaiah 53, according to the time in which Isaiah wrote it, it's hard to see what would take place, right? Because he speaks about the one who would be pierced through, who would carry their errors. So clearly they did understand it to involve the giving of life in connection with the type of sacrifices they gave in a temporary sense, to in a more permanent way heal them. That's what it says in the text of Isaiah right here. If we look back at what we were reading, it says he will see the fruit of his sacrifices, and that he will justify many. He will carry their guilt. I'm going to show you again the text. He will justify many. He would carry their guilt, and that he would stand up for those who sin. So these were all the associations that they had for him as it pertained to the Messiah. 100 to 400 years in terms of the earliest copies, and 800 and more years before Jesus actually began his ministry, if we go according to the time when Isaiah actually lived in the 8th century. So, and I know there's a section here as well where it talks about him providing healing, but it's not standing out to me quite yet. But, oh, here it is right here. So it says in verse 5, but he was pierced through because of our errors, badly beaten because of our guilt. So think about how you would interpret this in Isaiah's time in the 8th century, or even, let's say, in the 1st century BC, before Jesus was born, in the Jewish communities. Punishment for the sake of our security came to be upon him, and by his pain we have been healed. And this, of course, relates to his, down in verse 12, the carrying away of the sins of many. So they understood this, right? The fruit of his sacrifice would be compensation. It would serve as compensation. And he would be alongside criminals, just as we read about in connection with Jesus. This is what they were reading before Jesus was even born. And that's why we believe this is evidence, pre-Christian evidence, that Jesus is the biblical Messiah.